This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are talking with Samuel Gregg about issues of globalism and free trade and the future of globalism amid so many rising countervailing forces in Western democracies. Samuel Gregg is the research director at the Acton Institute. He writes and speaks extensively on finance, economics, natural law theory, political economy. He's also the author of many books, including most recently For God and Profit, and also Becoming Europe and Wilhelm Röpke's Political Economy. The last two books he appeared on this program to discuss. Sam, welcome to Liberty Law Talk. Glad to have you back.
Richard, it's always good to be with you.
So thinking about two of your more recent books, Becoming Europe and Wilhelm Röpke's Political Economy, that seems to give you, I think, a unique lens to speak to this issue of globalization and how it's unfolded, I think, over the last 30 years, maybe since the end of the Cold Wars when it kicked into high gear. I think about the key aspects of that process. The cost of information, of sharing information, fell dramatically. Tariffs around the world fell dramatically. Sort of a global English language in business became a norm. Container shipping and also computerization, which I think launched global supply chains to replace assembly lines. So all of that working, and we also, most people would say, 600 million people roughly lifted out of poverty over this process, over these 3 decades. And yet the contretemps, the controversy, angst, frustration over globalism spilling out in the politics of Western democracies. So Sam, maybe help us figure this out. What's been good? What's been bad? What do people maybe not understand so well about this process of globalism?
Well, I think what you just described as some of the economic implications of globalization are well understood by significant segments of the population, but also not understood by other segments of the population. Part of the issue is that things like globalization, which is really the expansion of free trade and the lowering of barriers to exchange and trade, many of its benefits are effectively what you might call invisible. So, for example, free trade tends to reduce prices for consumers because as different countries discover their comparative advantage, they learn how to do things more efficiently, more effectively, and that produces lower prices for consumers. The problem is we don't notice this. We don't see how this is happening in society. The cause and effect is very clear, but people in everyday life don't notice this. And that's part of the issue, because when you think about it, the benefits of globalization in terms of these millions of people that you've just mentioned who have been lifted out of poverty, but also those people in developed countries who are paying lower prices for all sorts of things, that's all well and good. But that often goes unnoticed. And these things happen over a period of time. It's not like suddenly you open up trade with, say, China, and suddenly the prices of everything drop dramatically. It's a much more gradual process. So the benefits of globalization, the very tangible economic benefits of globalization, often pass unnoticed. The second thing is that there are very few people out there who are effectively lobbying for globalization. There's plenty of groups out there who are lobbying for subsidies, who are lobbying for protection, who are lobbying for tariffs for their particular industry, their particular country, their particular state, their particular community. But those who benefit from globalization, these millions of consumers, they're not an organized group. They're scattered individuals. There's millions of them, but they're scattered individuals all around the world, and they're not organized in the same way that those people who are in favor of a return to a type of economic protectionism are very much organized. So that's one thing. I think a second problem that we're experiencing, and this is, I think, a problem with advocates of globalization, is that for better or worse, globalization has become associated with what I call Davos man. Who's Davos Man? Davos Man is these people who go to Davos every year to meet at the World Economic Forum, who gather together from all around the world, from all sorts of different professions, and they talk to each other about how wonderful globalization is, how great its benefits are, all the fantastic things it's doing, et cetera, et cetera. But there's very definitely a sense that this is an elite that's interested in its own particular agendas, that's interested in particular segments of the population in Western developed countries, primarily people like themselves. And there's this deep sense that Davos Man is very detached from the concerns and anxieties of ordinary people. And that, I think, is toxic. It's a toxic mixture for the cause of globalization, because once it becomes associated with groups who are perceived and in many cases are completely out of touch with the rest of the population, it becomes much harder to sell the benefits of globalization to ordinary people. The last thing I'll say, because there's so much more that could be said about this, but I think this point is also important, is that not everyone wins from globalization. In the long term, in terms of falling prices, countries discovering their comparative advantages, the benefits of competition, all these things benefit everyone. But in the short term, and even maybe in the medium term, there are some losers. So if you're a 55-year-old coal miner in Pennsylvania who's lost their job because it's more efficient for Americans to do other occupations, or because it's the comparative advantage of other countries to produce coal at lower and better prices, it's very hard for that 55-year-old coal miner to transition to a job in Silicon Valley producing something to do with technology. It's just not that easy a transition for them. So they look around and they see communities where businesses have left, where large industries have moved overseas, and they're looking at this and saying, well, this has not benefited me at all. It's disrupted my life. I no longer have a job. My skills are more or less redundant. What am I supposed to do? So I think people start to get very, very angry about that. And I think that helps to explain why you see a great deal of backlash against globalization, not just in America, obviously, but also in many European countries as well.
Let me sort of build on a critique that I've heard, that I've read recently about competitive advantage, which you alluded to. So the economist Ricardo is really the first person to articulate this in a systematic way about how nations can benefit from trade. Some arguing now with computer technology, the robustness of computer technology, the mobility of knowledge that it makes possible, that a comparative advantage in the ways in which Ricardo thought about it no longer holds true. That is to say, the offshoring process breaks production into parts where it can be sent to different countries, and what maybe Western nations like America or Germany or others hold is sort of a key knowledge aspect of that process, maybe a high value added process. But all of the manufacturing or the stuff, the putting together, goes to nations like Korea, China, India, etc. And that just, you empty out, the argument is you empty out, because this computerization process, really your core production capabilities, and very few people can do these high-end jobs. And so in that sense, they're arguing comparative advantage no longer works in the same ways that these 17th, 18th century economists described it. What do you say to that?
Well, there's some truth to that. There's no question that let's call it the computerization of so much of the economy these days has meant that a whole range of skills that are once important are not so important anymore. So there is some truth to that. On the other hand, it's also true that people in developing countries are benefiting immensely from the fact that what they have to offer in this global economy is their labor and their ability and willingness to work at a lower price than, say, people in Western countries. So I think it's true to say that what you can see happening as a consequence of globalization is that, as you mentioned, we've seen all these people getting out of poverty hundreds of millions of people getting out of poverty. And we've also seen this reductions in global inequality. So when you hear people talking about growing global inequality, that's simply not true. What is true is that in some developed countries, primarily in North America and Western Europe, you are seeing some growth in inequality. And I think that reflects part of what you're talking about with the way that computerization has changed the nature of comparative advantage and the types of skills that people need in this new economy compared to, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I think that there's some truth to that. Now, but that is not an argument, to my mind, against globalization. What it is an argument for being very attentive to the fact that there are some groups that don't benefit in the short term from globalization, and we have been generally very bad at helping people to transition to this new economy in Western countries. That's partly because there's plenty of politicians and interest groups that will have a vested interest in trying to maintain what I think is an unsustainable status quo. But also I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there are just a lot of groups out there that are against globalization for economic reasons, for political reasons, but also the sort of general anxiety, I think, that people feel about this sense of uncertainty. Now, there are some people who like uncertainty, who can benefit from uncertainty, who revel in uncertainty. But a lot of people are not built like that. A lot of people have a very different disposition. And I think that's something that advocates of globalization, who include people like myself, have not taken sufficient heed of when it comes to this very complicated political world that is being created by the processes of economic globalization.
So many thoughts coming to mind here. So thinking about manufacturing just in America. So a widely cited statistic, I think 1955 was the peak of manufacturing jobs in America. And then the decline of those jobs, my sense is, and I think you would agree, the evidence is that has come about through technology, through more sophisticated technology, doing more with less human labor. And most of those jobs have not been lost to trade. That seems to be lost largely in public debates. Although I think it's widely known among economists and others who dig into this area. However, and I wonder what you would say to this. I think his name is David Autor. I think that's how you say his name. Economist at MIT, who's been writing with others that when China came into the WTO, I believe it was 1995, one can really trace the loss of jobs in America to their entry. So there could just be, I've thought, it's like, well, free trade works in moderation. And there was something about the nature of China, perhaps, that made it, just the size of the Chinese economy and what it could absorb, that made it this sort of an acute problem in America in certain ways over the last 2 decades. I think there's also an issue, and maybe I'm bringing too much in here. There's also an issue here, too, I think, with globalism and just the requirements of democracy. And
right.
does it seem to just sideline democracy or straitjacket democracy? A lot of people would say, yeah, that's good. But the people who say that are pretty few in number.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I would say. First of all, it's not just China that's entered in this very big way into the global economy. It's also India, right? So we all have had the experience of...
it seems, if you think about that widely cited number of 600 million people out of poverty, from what I've read, it's China, Korea, India, Poland, Indonesia, and Thailand. Where most of that's
it's very much a Southeast Asian phenomenon in many respects. Yeah, no, I think that's true. So to say this is just China, I think is not quite correct. I think it's fair to say that you've seen some very large countries in, let's call it East Asia, that are clawing their way out of poverty in ways that, and at a speed that's actually unprecedented in human history. Now, that's interesting when you think about it, though, because that has not somehow meant that the American economy has shrunk. The American economy continues to provide lots and lots of jobs. It's just not the same types of jobs that were being produced before. So we're moving away from an industrial economy to an economy that's very much based upon tertiary industry. And what should matter really is not so much the type of jobs, but the number of jobs and whether we have a population that is well equipped to take on those types of jobs. So that's the first thing. The political thing, however, which you just mentioned, I think is in some respects a separate issue because on the one hand, I happen to be an advocate of economic globalization mainly for economic reasons. But on the other hand, we do see the rise of what you might call this political drive towards globalism. And that's something that's a little different. It's a little different because it implies the growth of supranational and international institutions that increasingly claim a type of sovereignty, that claim to basically be diminishing national forms of sovereignty. We see this most advanced, of course, in the European Union. And what's ironic about all that is that at the same time we have this economic globalization going on, we also see efforts to centralize political power in supranational and international institutions that are about as undemocratic as it gets when it comes to political structures. So you find, for example, this strange thing in Europe whereby you have the European Union, at least it has this internal market, which is one instance, I guess, of globalization. But on the other hand, you're not seeing a massive increase in what you might call political liberty. In fact, you're seeing shrinking political liberty as more and more decisions are shifted towards groups that are essentially highly undemocratic in nature, such as the European Commission in Brussels. And when it comes to something like Brexit, one of the things I found about Brexit is that it wasn't, to my mind, so much a reaction against free trade and globalization, although there were some people like that. Brexit, I think, is explicable primarily in terms of not an anti-free trade thing, not an anti-economic globalization thing, but much more in terms of we're tired of having these bureaucratic quasi-authoritarians in Brussels tell us what to do. And I think that's a very important distinction we need to make, that the cause of economic globalization, the opening up of markets of free trade, which generally I think in the long term is a good thing for everyone, does not need to go hand in hand with the expansion and growth of these supranational global institutions that don't even pretend to be particularly interested in political liberty and democracy and all the good things that we associate with Western civilization. If anything, they're trying to empty out the distinct content of Western civilization when it comes to the type of political structures that we have in the West today. So I think I'm very much someone who's an advocate of economic globalization, but I'm very, very skeptical of this move towards what you might call political globalism, this supranational instinct that the political classes have clearly bought into.
But is that as I listen to you, I agree with you. Is it realistic though to think one could have the sort of free trade regime globally that we have now without those institutions? I mean, I suppose the answer is yeah, we could, but it seems to me what we would probably more likely get is bilateral free trade agreements, and each nation would negotiate, which currently happens. I mean, I have not yet sat down to read NAFTA or WTO or anything like that. My sense is these are largely not mercantilist, but each country is trying to protect certain industries, certain corporations, sectors of the economy in these free trade agreements. Certainly, thinking about the Pacific Agreement that was jettisoned recently, I think that there's no way it was thousands of pages I've read unless that was going on. So a lot of the critics, I think, probably have a point when they object in this way, and say what's really being sidelined is borders and the abilities of countries to self-determine and shape their future. Think about something Roger Scruton said: free trade is a fiction. It just doesn't.
This is an important thing.
Yeah.
In fact, I wrote an article about this in the stream, in which I said it's very important to understand that most free trade agreements should not be automatically assumed as something that expand free trade. Free trade agreements, whether they're bilateral or multilateral, involve trade-offs between governments as they negotiate with domestic constituencies and with other countries about the way that they want to go forward when it comes to economically interacting with other countries. So the notion that somehow for any free trade agreement somehow is the same thing as free trade, I think that's something we need to be very careful about assuming that that's the case. So that's a very important thing. The other thing you mentioned about whether it's inevitable that you're going to have these type of arrangements. Well, on one level, yes. I mean, I'd like to see free trade agreements whereby countries, whether it's 2 countries, 3 countries, whatever number of countries, say things like, there shall be free trade between the following countries, and that's it. I'd like to think that would happen. I think, politically speaking, that's very difficult. But we also know, if you look historically, at the 19th century, and even up until the early 20th century, you saw the biggest expansion of free trade and what we would call economic globalization that had happened in a relatively short period of time across the world. But you didn't have the emergence of these big supranational institutions that people said are an inevitable consequence and a necessary addition to any economic globalization. There were plenty of, all these countries maintained sovereignty. All these countries didn't pretend that they were somehow subject to the United Nations or something like a League of Nations or anything like that. In other words, the arguments in favor of free trade do not have to be couched in terms of, well, this also means that you have to go along with this entire globalist agenda, which is very much about centralizing power in increasingly unaccountable bureaucracies, which I think is the dilemma that organizations like the European Union have right now. Because on one level, they're sort of talking about free trade, but they're in fact much more insistent upon the need to pool sovereignty, to diminish national sovereignty. They're quite open about this. And that, I think, is something that free traders have to be very, very careful before they start association with what you might call this political globalism agenda, because I think if there's anything that drives a lot of people away from free trade arguments and the position that economic globalization is good, one of the things that drives people away is this sense that, okay, this means we're going to have some sort of world government in which my voice will become even less important than it already is.
Yeah, no, interesting. The current podcast that I have up is with Theodore Dalrymple on the prospects for Brexit going forward, and looking at that process a year later after this, the momentous vote. And it is interesting to watch the European Union, whose interests seem to be, or they seem to understand their interest to be, punishing the United Kingdom as much as they can. Raising the notion that this is really a protectionist regime. If you're inside the European Union, you're subject to all manner of regulations, but you get the benefits, and they have to punish the UK because they certainly don't want other countries within the EU to think there are no consequences from leaving. It sort of raises sort of an East German specter, I think, in certain respects over the European Union in terms of keeping people in. Or how do I keep you in? I have to make it very painful to leave. And thinking also here, this question of these institutions, these global institutions, seems to me paradoxical to, or in opposition to the way the European Union thinks about nation states. Globalization, free trade, we haven't talked about immigration, that also is working here, actually rests on pretty strong nation states for it to work, I think, well. And I think, so Sam, it seems that, actually free trade, I think immigration also, another sub-issue, rests on really strong nation states, and people believing that there's something coherent they belong to, that actually protects and works in favor of their history, their culture, and citizenship, and that we actually don't want this to be eliminated in favor of this sort of NGO, we are the world thinking.
Yes, I think that's certainly driving a lot of what you see with regard to the backlash against globalization, because in some respects there's this tendency to say, well, it's nationalism versus globalism. I'm not sure that's quite correct, because I think it's much more a question of people having the sense that with a nation, there's a community that you belong to. There's traditions. There's a distinct history. There's even, in some cases, a particular language. And all these things constitute a type of identity. And the notion that one is going to give this up so that one can blur into this sort of vague, sentimental humanitarianism, which, as far as I can tell, is what the European Union stands for, because it simply won't talk about the deeper cultural roots of history, of European history. Right, they won't talk about this except in this sort of very, very sort of values. We have European values, and you ask them what they mean by that. Well, tolerance, diversity, blah, blah. And it sounds like just another humanitarian NGO. And there's a lot of people who say, really, that's what you're asking us to root ourselves in? And I think that advocates of globalization, economic globalization, need to be much more conscious that they can't just sort of assume that that is unimportant to people. Identity does matter to people. Community does matter to people. And all those things are indeed compatible with open markets. It's this tendency to think that you have to accompany open markets with these sort of very shallow, in terms of moral commitments, ethical commitments, political commitments, very shallow commitments, plus these overweening bureaucracies that are full of people who clearly believe that they know what's best for the rest of us. And that, I think, is really what is hurting a lot of the movement for greater economic globalization. The same people who are among its heaviest advocates, in many respects, are some of the people who are doing it the most damage.
So in a way, listening to you talk, the thought occurs to me is something like free trade isn't really what maybe Davos man is after. I wonder. It's right. A part of it. What Davos man, to like your phrase, is after some sort of conception of an autonomous, liberated individual, beholden to nothing in the past, no religious, cultural, thick heritage in the past. Certainly not a loyalty to a nation state. And it's sort of go forward. There's sort of like a globalized middle class. And of course, we're running up into the hard reality that that's really not how people live.
That, and the other thing which is accompanying that, it's not just this sort of I am my own creator and I am my liberty and I am my autonomy, et cetera, et cetera. It's also the fact that the same people, ironically enough, also want to make everyone else behave and act exactly the same way. Plus, a lot of them have what I would call more or less social democratic instincts when it comes to dealing with issues of, for example, poverty and inequality. When I think of Davos man, who would I think of? I think of people like Tony Blair. I think of people like Bill Clinton. I even think of Hillary Clinton. I think of people like Jean-Claude Juncker. And what do they all have in common? Well, they talk about values, but when it gets down to it, the values are actually pretty shallow. They're not particularly concrete. They talk about freedom, but which they mean a sort of type of
self-norming,
self-norming. I create myself. I am the master of my destiny. I am my liberty, et cetera, et cetera. Things in the past are be dispensed with because I'm modern and you're not. But they're also determined to use the state to engage in a high degree of social engineering. And also, they're not actually as neutral as they often claim to be. They have a very distinct identity and vision when it comes to things like what they think people should be using their freedom for. They're not particularly interested in religious liberty, for example.
No.
They're also not particularly interested in anything that might suggests that sometimes some forms of self-expression, some forms of let me be the master of myself and create myself can actually be very damaging for other people and have real consequences for other people. And so this, I think, is one of the reasons, among many, why you're seeing this backlash against economic globalization. And as I keep saying, the cause for free trade and economic globalization, if it's not disassociated from Davos man, if it's not as disassociated from this I am myself and my creation, then I think it's going to keep running into these significant problems. In other words, the cause of free trade needs to be grounded in a quite different vision of the human person and community. And fortunately, I think there are some free market thinkers who one can look to in that regard. Wilhelm Röpke, for example, was very much a free trader, very much in favor of open markets. But he was rigorously against the European Union at a time when no one was against the European Union, because he didn't like the bureaucracy, and he also predicted, rightly, that it would end up effectively emptying out the distinct characteristics of European culture, especially as that is expressed through different national identities and cultures. So there's plenty of people who have said, no, you can have both these things. But I think one of the problems with a lot of free traders is they think we need to dispense with all those things from the past, all that is essentially redundant in favor of this new person, this new autonomous person who is and expresses their liberty and whose exercise of liberty is not particularly concerned with how that might affect the sorts of norms and the sorts of communities that we need if we're going to have full citizens who have a commitment to something that goes beyond me, myself, and my freedom.
Thinking here also, and this could be like an entirely different series of podcasts, so I don't want to, I'm not trying to change our thought here, but it seems also the opposition to free trade that we're seeing when we see these things like Brexit, which I think you're right. I think that was much more about the European Union and control over your UK laws and borders, the inability to police the UK border in any real self-governing way. But do you see something like Brexit? You see Donald Trump get elected. You see, I think, Le Pen lost. We would say that's a pretty big blowout, 25 points. But also, Le Pen and those forces aren't going anywhere. And throughout the European Union, I don't think any corner's been turned on these nationalist movements. In many ways, they might regroup and get much smarter and savvier from recent defeats. When you look at these sorts of things, it sort of raises in my mind, though, a lot of other sturdy contexts for freedom and community have dissipated over the last several decades. And if we think about you talk about a vision of the human person for free trade, societies like the family, the political society, we would say religious society, I think, too, have dissipated, have fallen off. And so I think in certain respects, in America, in Europe, in the West, a lot of people sort of look around and say, where do I belong? It's not exactly clear what I belong to because we've made everything, it seems to me, it's just something that I select into, but there's nothing actually natural, real, or good that we belong to and which affirms us or which we are developed by and participate in and are loyal to. I know that's a really big separate discussion, but it seems to me this is would sort of motivate people in a way to be opposed greatly to what they see as something like free trade and the loss of jobs, et cetera.
Yes, and again, that's something I think that a lot of free traders and free marketers are not particularly good at talking about because, unfortunately, a lot of them think in, frankly, economistic terms about a lot of the world, and we're not economistic beings. We are beings who are made in a particular way. We are individuals, but we're also social. We have a type of individuality, but we also have, by nature, a type of sociability. And a lot of that is expressed in historical formations, whether they're nations, whether they're particular communities, particular towns, particular religious traditions, etc. And when you uproot people from those things, or worse, you tell people that they have to abandon these things because they're a type of archaic remnant from the past, you should not be surprised if people start reacting negatively. The other thing we're discovering as a consequence of globalization is that the notion that all cultures can somehow get along is simply not true. It's simply not true. I mean, this is one of the reasons why you have such angst about immigration in Europe, because it's very clear that many of the people who are migrating to Europe are not assimilating, they're not learning the native language, many of them are going on welfare, many of them have a view of the political community that's diametrically opposed to the way that the West has traditionally understood the relationship between the religious sphere and the temporal sphere. And guess what? They're discovering that many of these people are not interested in adapting. They want things to remain the way they are in the way that they understand the world. And I think just to imagine that, well, free trade is just going to solve this problem. As long as people engage in trade, this is going to fix all these problems. No, it's not.
Yeah.
And it's clearly not fixing these problems. I mean, we see, for example, that when you look, for example, at the people who are engaged in terrorist acts in the United States or in Europe, most of them are not coming from poor, impoverished backgrounds. Most of them are actually well-educated. Many of them have spent much time in the West. They're very familiar with the West. So in other words, the notion that globalization is just going to sort of smooth all these cultural differences over and make these basic incompatibilities somehow irrelevant, guess what? It's turning out not to be the case, which tells you that economics can't solve these problems. That is not an argument against a free trade. It's not an argument against open markets. It's an argument for combining these things with an attentiveness to the social, cultural, and political character of human beings and realizing that there are some conflicts which have to be resolved, and not all cultures are compatible with free and open societies. That's a hard thing to hear. That's a deeply unpolitically correct thing to say, but none of those things make it untrue.
And to build on your comments, maybe something even more controversial that I think about with regard to Europe and say immigrants from North Africa or other Islamic countries is, do these European nations even know what they're about, such that they can offer them something to immigrate or to assimilate into?
Right.
And I think I wonder there too. And it's also the case, Western societies are rule-bound, rule-following societies where people who have accumulated amounts of high human capital, of development, of education thrive, and those who can sort of navigate complex settings are able to thrive. And if you're new to this, you're probably not going to thrive. There's only going to be a thin layer of people immigrating into who can right away step into a high-paying position. And so I thought all of this just brings to mind the deep folly of what Angela Merkel did 3 years ago, or 3 years ago when she declared Germany open to anyone who could get there. That's just deeply foolish. Also, it seems to me all of these issues we can't separate from the 2008 financial crisis. The more that I think about it, I'm curious to get your thoughts. That's sort of like the rock that broke everything, that smashed everything in terms of how we had been living in the West since the Cold War. Was it really sustainable? High amounts of debt, high amounts of consumption, but maybe not the production to back it up. And that sort of unlocked the pessimism about the future. And also this international global system, which seemed to spread the contagion so rapidly.
Yes, I think there's a lot to be said for that, because the nature of international finance is such is that it was, until relatively recently, highly integrated, which means that all the benefits are integrated, but also the problems. If they happen in one country, it's very hard to basically block yourself off from the effects in another. And the other thing, though, is that the financial industry, in many respects, precisely because it was so integrated, precisely because it employed such very talented, very intelligent, very well-paid individuals, mostly young, often single, moving to different countries on a relatively regular basis. There was a type of culture associated with that, and when the international financial crisis happened, which I think actually, to my mind, had a lot more to do with government regulation and bad government regulation and excessive regulation rather than people making mistakes themselves. The problem is that whole culture was seen as very much associated with this new global economic order. And when that all came tumbling down, it wasn't just the economic effects, it's also the cultural perception that all this was built upon sand, that the people working in that world are not quite real people, they're all detached, they're not particularly linked or rooted in a national community, etc., etc. So whether one likes it or not, the fact that that came down so quickly and had such negative effects throughout particularly Western countries, you can see how that created a lot of angst and anger against globalization, whether it's deserved or not. There's a reason why Marine Le Pen constantly referenced bankers in her presidential campaign, why she pointed out that Emmanuel Macron
was a banker,
comes from that world. There's a reason she did that. Now, I think you're also right. I don't think these movements are going away because it's not clear to me that those on the other side of the argument have come up with sufficient responses beyond saying things like, well, you're just ignorant, you'll learn, the market will take care of this in the long term. Now, I happen to think that markets solve all sorts of very complicated problems. I very much believe in open markets. But it seems to me that free traders and free marketers are not coming up with sufficient arguments or sufficient recognition of the negative dimension of economic globalization that is going to take away the base of support for many of these particular groups in Europe and the United States. And I think you're also right that Angela Merkel, when she basically declared open borders, well, I think that was a colossal mistake. That probably, I think, was one of the major factors that contributed to Brexit. I also think it just confirmed the sense among many Europeans that the European elites are interested in themselves, they're interested in broad economic arguments, but they're not paying attention to the political and cultural side sufficiently because they often think that economics is just going to solve all these problems. If only you would just let us get on and run things the way they think they should be run. That produces enormous resentment that's being reflected at the ballot box. I think, by the way, the most revealing thing about the French elections was how many people didn't vote. Incredible drop in the number of people that voted in a country where you have lots and lots of people voting. And when you add up the non-voters plus the people voting for Le Pen and the people who turned up and then cast a blank ballot, Macron didn't get anywhere near a majority of the vote.
No, thinking you raised a point there at the beginning, and maybe we can close with thinking about the leader of the international left, or maybe the leader of the international opposition to globalism, which I think is Pope Francis. I'd be curious to get your thoughts here. The accountability of capital, you made that point, had been diminished greatly by governments, and that is not appreciated as it should be. I do think, though, their ability to allow for capital not to be accountable to market losses, though, it does seem sort of related to the incredible amount of power, though, that banks have. Maybe the American economy, their percentage of control or of assets is I mean it's just incredible if you look at the data. And what did they really hold? And that's made possible. We could argue by government policies, but they're also able to influence those policies because of, you could argue, a power that globalism has afforded them. It seems overall. So it's hard to disentangle all of this, and particularly in the minds of people who look up once in a while and read or hear about something. But it sparks to mind that Pope Francis has said the global economy is not a system that invests in people. It's an extraction economy. It sucks the life out of places, and he's made this distinction, something we've been kind of talking about also. It takes familiar institutions and renders them impotent unless they will serve, he says, the empire of money. That's a direct quote. All of these things having to be dealt with. Your thoughts? I mean, Pope Francis, his economics, we can criticize them all day long, but his points seem to strike a deep chord, and there has to be a reason for that.
Well, yes, and there's a couple of things. One is, I think that I mean, just on the empirical level, many of the claims that Pope Francis makes about the global economy, whether it's regard to inequality, whether it's with regard to poverty, are simply empirically incorrect.
Yeah.
And that's been said again and again and again. But apparently he and his advisors are not particularly interested in hearing
what Sam Gregg
the
has
evidence.
To say.
Well, what the evidence, not me, it's what the evidence says about this.
But he talks about, and you hear this a lot, the financialized economy. And I guess what they mean is there's a real economy and there's a financialized economy. What does he mean there?
Well, I think what he means is something that's not actually a new point. You've heard this argument now for a very long time, at least for the past 200 years, that somehow finance and banking aren't really part of the real economy, that somehow there's the financial economy, and then there's people who go to jobs, who work in companies that make stuff and sell stuff, physical, tangible things. But the irony of all this is that it's very hard to talk about separate economies, because what is the financial industry about? It's about capital. They're in the business of providing capital to the rest of the economy, without which we'd live in a much poorer, more very unpleasant world. I mean, that's the genius of capital. That's the genius of leveraging capital in ways that you can invest and grow the economy so that we have economic growth that not just takes people out of poverty, but also keeps millions and millions of people out of poverty on a daily, monthly, yearly basis. So that's one thing. So I think that whole notion is mistaken. On the other hand, I do think it's true, and I talk about this in my book, For God and Profit, that there are parts of the financial industry that have become focused upon the management and development of financial products, so much so that it's the case that in many instances people are selling things they don't even understand themselves. That was very clear, for example, with a lot of derivative products during the 2007-2008 financial crisis. That's very true, I think, when it comes to what you might call the over-leveraging of assets. It's also true that many people in the financial industry, their job, these very smart people, is to basically leverage existing regulation in ways that benefits their company, their bank, their financial house. In other words, they become focused upon how do I arbitrage existing regulations, or how do I go and get the government or the Congress or the Parliament to pass particular forms of regulation that then I can go and further leverage to the advantage of my bank, my financial house, my hedge fund. And that is a significant problem. But that is not a problem of the financial industry itself. That's a problem with government trying to control something that is, in some respects, really should be only subject to what you might call general rules, which are known and transparent, instead of this incredibly complicated financial regulation system that we have right now, which has been made much worse by Dodd-Frank. And the only people who can afford to navigate that and who can afford to leverage it are, guess who? Big banks, big financial houses, big hedge funds, because they can pay very, very smart people to work out how to use these regulations and to their own particular advantage. So while I think the Pope's analysis that somehow the financial system is somehow completely separate and it's not real, that's not true. But it is true that there are particular problems in the financial sector, many of which are enabled by excessive attempts to regulate the system, that cause all sorts of dysfunctionality, both in terms of the role that these organizations play and the way that they understand their own role in the economy.
No, well said. Well said. As I think about that, it seems to me he refuses, or maybe willful refusal, not to think about these larger issues of political economy and regulation when he pronounces upon them. It's sort of, and this is not just in economics. When he pronounces, it's sort of like he wants to speak to people who are directly hurting on some sort of experiential level, without thinking largely about ideas, concepts, and overall, an overall estimate of what's true.
Well, the other thing I think
false.
it's important to keep in mind here is that, in the book Forgotten Profit, I talk about this. When the financial crisis was going on, Pope Benedict was visiting the seminary in Rome, and some of the seminarians asked him, "What do you think should be our response to this? How should I talk to the people in my pews about this when I become a priest?" And Pope Benedict said, "Look, obviously there are problems in the financial system, but we as priests, we have to be very careful before we start talking about the technical dimension of this. We have to be very careful before we start acting in a quote-unquote moralistic way about this, because often this is not our field of expertise."
That's right.
And if we're going to be talking about these things, yes, point out injustices, draw attention to the needs of those who have been left behind or have been hurt by the financial crisis. But let's be much more measured in what we say, because our field is helping people to live good lives. And if we're going to talk about some of these things to do with banking and finance and the international financial industry, it probably behooves us to understand a little bit of the system, to pay attention to some of those people who are involved in everyday life in these particular institutions, so that when we make a comment or offer thoughts on this subject, they are at least at some level informed by evidence and experience of what goes on in these particular industries. And that I think is a very good cautionary note that Pope Benedict articulated when he was talking to his seminarians. I see less evidence of that degree of prudence when it comes to Pope Francis's pronouncements on these issues.
Or really any.
Much prudence at all.
I was thinking Pope Francis obviously was not there that day or had his ears plugged when one reads these encyclicals. Okay, Sam, Gregg, thank you so much for talking to us about globalism and rising forces opposing it. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Richard, thank you. Always good to be with you and with Library of Law and Liberty.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.